Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about hidden gems. More specifically, we are talking about underutilized record collections on Ancestry that might be really beneficial for your family history research. Today we are going to focus on a couple of areas. We're going to talk about census records that are not the typical federal census records you usually think about. We're going to talk about some immigration records that are a little bit lesser known, and we'll talk about some military records. And then if we have time, I might throw in a bonus or two. Now, for those of you who are new to family history, one of the things that is important is that you understand a little bit about the Ancestry collection of records. We have more than 20 billion historical records on our website, and those records are contained in more than 32,000 different databases. We add an average of 2 million new records every single day. And that might seem really overwhelming, but what that means is that we are the largest repository of online family history records in the world, and it means you have all these resources at your fingertips. However, navigating it sometimes feels a little bit tricky. So one of the ways we help you navigate that is we provide that little leaf hint. One of the things you need to know, though, is that the leaf hint only looks at the top 10% of our most popular databases. So we're only looking at 3,000 or so databases in the Ancestry collection in order to provide you with those leaf hints, and it's going to be those most popular databases. Our census records, New York passenger lists, World War I draft cards, those kinds of things. Now, I do have an entire video about going beyond the shaky leaf. I will put a link to it in the description here for this video so that you can go and watch that. Now, again, for those of you who are new, the other thing you need to understand is that one of the best ways, once you get through some of those shaky leaf hints, to navigate the collections on Ancestry is through the card catalog. I'm not going to take a lot of time today to talk about how to navigate the card catalog, but again, I have done an entire video on that. I'll put a link to that here in the description for this video as well. So again, for those of you who are new, you need to understand about going beyond the shaky leaf, and you need to understand how to navigate the card catalog. Now, for those of you who feel confident in those two areas, we're going to talk then about some of the specific record collections that you can discover through the card catalog that will help you in your family history research. Let's start specifically with what I call Census Plus. Now, most of you are probably familiar with the U.S. federal census. It's been taken every 10 years since 1790. 1790, 1800, 1810, and so on, right up through 2010. The next federal census will be taken in 2020. There is a 72-year privacy law on the census, so the most recently available federal census is the 1940 census. The 1950 census becomes available in 2022. I've already got a countdown clock. However, what you might not be aware of is that as part of the census, one of the things that sometimes happens is there are additional schedules to that census that provide more information. So particularly, I just want to highlight the mortality schedules. The mortality schedules are included on the 1850, 60, 70, and 80 census, so 40 years of census records. And then there was a request from the federal government that states also take a complete a mortality schedule for 1885. Now, not every state complied. As a matter of fact, not even most states complied, but there are a few states who did, and so we do have them for 1885 for a few states as well. Now, there are some really important things to understand about the mortality schedules. First is, what they were asking was for the name, age, cause of death, and other information for anyone who died from the 1st of June through the 31st of May for the preceding year. So in 1850, they were asking for anyone who died from June 1st, 1849 through May 31st, 1850. So you get this view of individuals who died during that time period. Let me just show you really quickly where you're going to find information out about that mortality schedule. Again, in the card catalog, you can go in there and you can search. This is like card catalog 201. Hopefully you've already mastered card catalog 101. You can come in here and you can actually search by the word mortality. And what it will bring up is the U.S. federal census mortality schedules. Now, I recommend highly, and you'll hear me say this over and over, Before you ever search any new database on Ancestry, and by new I mean one you're not familiar with, scroll down past that search box and you'll see a database description that will provide you with a lot of information about exactly what is and is not included in the record set, some of the limitations, what you can do with some of that information, where that information could lead you for more information about your family history. So you'll see here lots of really great information in this mortality schedules database description. You'll also notice a browse box over here on the right-hand side that tells you there are images attached. You can use it to just see, for example, in 1885, which states complied. Well, there were 3 of them, Colorado, Florida, and Nebraska. But you'll notice that for the other census years, we have a more exhaustive list of states. So that's a really quick, easy way just to see what's available in the census or in the mortality schedule before you start searching it. Now, back to this database description. There are going to be things like the name of the deceased, their sex, their age, their color, whether or not they're single or married or widowed, their place of birth, when they died, their profession, the cause of death, how long they were sick. Starting with 1870, which is a real bonus, it will list the parents' birthplaces. In the federal census, in the typical federal census, that information wasn't recorded until 1880, so we get that 10 years earlier here. And then other information about their particular illness or disease. So lots of really great information contained in these mortality schedules. And one of the benefits for those in the Black community who may have ancestors who were enslaved is that those individuals were listed by name in pre-emancipation mortality schedules. So typically those who were enslaved, the very first census that they're enumerated in by name is the 1870 census. However, if they died in that year prior to the 1850 or 1860 mortality schedule, they will be listed by name in those particular records. And that's true pretty much across the board. So that's a really good benefit of these records. Another Census Plus type record is what we call non-population schedules. So these are specifically agricultural schedules. So agricultural schedules are going to hold information about how much acreage and what your ancestor was growing on that property, and did they have livestock, and how much of that livestock did they breed, and how much did they slaughter, how many bushels of corn, and how much, I mean, it gives really detailed information. Non-population schedules are great for actually establishing identity of individuals in your family tree, which is what we are doing in genealogy, is trying to figure out, is this John Smith living in this place, my John Smith, and then who are his parents as opposed to this other guy's parents, and we're trying to sort out the identity of individuals so that we make sure we're climbing our own family tree and not someone else's, and non-population schedules can help to do that. But the other benefit of these schedules is that they provide us with this really rich, detailed picture of the snapshot of their life in that particular year. Now again, much like the mortality schedules, they start in 1850. They go through 1880, so we've got 4 different non-population schedules, and they are supposed to have reported information from the 1st of June the previous year to the 31st of May in the census year. So agricultural schedules, there are manufacturing schedules, there are social statistics. The social statistics and supplementals are of particular interest to genealogists because these are not name-based records, they're community-based records. So we end up with information like what schools were in the area, what lodges and clubs and organizations, what cemeteries existed. So we get all sorts of detailed information about the community's social, it's called social statistics and supplementals. That's a mouthful. We get all kinds of information and details about the community. So if you can find the community where your ancestor lived in that particular non-population schedule, then you're going to have some additional information about what churches existed, what schools existed, what organizations your ancestor may have belonged to, and that can lead you to other records or other information in the community about your ancestor. Now, again, the easiest, fastest way to get to these records is just simply to go to the card catalog, type in non-population, click search and it'll come right up. Again, be sure to read that database description. One of the things you're going to discover is, again, not every state turned these records over to the federal government. And so not every state has non-population schedules, but for those that do, super, super rich record. Now, there is another type of non-population schedule that was included, and Ancestry has broken it out into a separate database. The official title of that schedule in the federal census was the Dependent, Defective, and Delinquent Schedule. So it is its own schedule here, and actually there is a link to it in the database description for the non-population schedule. You just click the little link here and it will take you to that particular database. Now, it is just for the 1880 census. And again, if you read the database description, you're going to find out the types of people in 1880 that were considered defective, dependent, or delinquent. Now, those are words that probably have a lot of loaded meaning for some people in today's world, but you have to remember this was 1880, different sensibilities, different mindset about things. And so these are the descriptive words or the classes of individuals that would be included on this particular census. In this case, it's going to be those who are classed as insane, idiots, deaf mutes, blind, paupers and indigent persons, homeless children, and prisoners. So that's the specific classes of individuals that the federal government laid out should be included in this particular schedule in that year 1880. Again, really useful for family history, also really insightful into the times in which our ancestors lived and some of the things that they might have dealt with within their families and within their particular communities. Okay, now I don't want to spend too much time on this because I'm pretty sure I've done an entire video on state censuses, but it just bears pointing out or reminding people that sometimes we get really excited about and hung up on the federal censuses because they're the foundational work for U.S. family history research. However, in the U.S., the federal government requested that states also take censuses. Now, typically, the state census is going to be every 10 years on the 5s. So the federal census in the U.S. is every 10 years on the 0s, 1900, 1910, 1920. The state censuses are typically going to be on the 5s, right? 1885, 1895, 1905. It's important to keep in mind that not all states did this. Those states that did this didn't necessarily do it every 10 years. Every once in a while, you'll find an anomaly. For example, in some places, Oklahoma, Oregon, Utah, those states come to mind right off the top of my head. A lot of times when they were trying to gain statehood, they would take a state census to send information to the federal government about their bid for statehood. And so they might be in some totally odd year, 1892 or 1897. And so keep that in mind as well. And then you also need to realize that they're, unlike the federal census, where every year, every state gets the exact same form to fill out, the state censuses are inconsistent in format because every state decided what they wanted to enumerate for the people of their state. And so they're pretty inconsistent. Also keep in mind that there are some states where the census actually covered more than one page. Iowa in particular had at least one census year where it was 2 pages, and then another census year where it was 4 pages. So you have to recognize what the line number is of the family you're looking for, and then realize that there's additional information. That particular, the Iowa State Census in particular is important because I think on like page 3 or 4 of that census year, they actually ask for information about the parents. And so you can sometimes find an additional generation of non-living individuals listed in the census because they're parents of individuals who are living in Iowa at that particular time. So always be sure, check a page or 2 before, a page or 2 after for additional information. And even when it's just a 1-page census, you can sometimes find other family members if you remember to check preceding and succeeding pages. Okay, let's move on to immigration. Now, most of you are familiar with what we call inbound passenger lists. You're familiar with people coming into New York or Philadelphia or Charleston or Boston or any one of the dozens of ports here in the United States when your ancestors and relatives immigrated into this country. But one of the things you might not be aware of is that Ancestry also has outbound passenger lists. Now, Those outbound passenger lists are not for the United States. That's an important thing to keep in mind. Apparently, the US doesn't care who leaves. We only care who comes in. However, there are other countries who did keep track of who left. Most specifically, the UK and Germany. So if your ancestor was from Europe and coming to the United States, very often they would have left from Hamburg, Germany, or Bremen, Germany. Sometimes they would have left from France or other ports in Europe. But Hamburg in particular was a really major port of emigration out of Europe. And so if you haven't been able to find your ancestor, or even if you have on an incoming passenger list into the United States, maybe you can check the Hamburg passenger lists and you can see your ancestor leaving Europe. Now, they do not have to have been from Hamburg. People took trains and other modes of transportation from all over Europe to get to ports to be able to leave to come to the United States. And so, even if they were from somewhere that you're thinking, why would they go to Hamburg? Well, Hamburg was a major port of emigration, and so it's worth checking. Now, keep in mind these records are in German. Ancestry has translated field labels, but sometimes the actual information on the record, like for example, if they have an occupation or a relationship to the people traveling together, sometimes that information is written in German, even if German was not the language of your ancestor who was traveling. It's because it was Hamburg was the port in Germany. So these records cover 1850 through 1934 and are certainly worth looking at. I do just want to make note, because sometimes I get asked, these are German records. So they are only available to people if you have a world subscription, or if you live in Germany and only have a German subscription. So if you live in the US, you have a US subscription, or you have a world subscription, the Hamburg records are part of the world subscription because they are considered German records. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, the other thing, I also mentioned UK outbound passenger lists. So the UK, sometimes people would travel from anywhere, any port in Europe, and they would go to England, and then they would get on a ship in England to come to Canada or to come to the United States. And so the UK outbound passenger lists are also really beneficial. However, you'll note the date here, they don't start until 1890. So they're a little bit later for a lot of you, but for some of you who have family who came in that real peak of immigration into the United States, 1890 to 1910. If you remember, Ellis Island opened in 1892, so this predates that by just a couple of years. This is going to be a really great collection. Again, not every single passenger list of every single person who came into the United States survives. So these outbound passenger lists might be the only record you have of an ancestor's leaving the old world to come to the new world. But even if you found your ancestor on an incoming passenger list, finding them on an outward passenger list might provide you with more information, more context, more details about them, about their lives, about where they came from, who their other family members might be. So these are super, super valuable records. Now, the other collection we have is what we call border crossings, and that's how you can find it in the card catalog. If you just type in border crossings and do a search, they'll come up. We have a series of border crossings. You'll notice here from the dates on your screen. We have border crossings from Canada into the United States. Those date from 1825 to 1960. There's about a little more than, well, almost 5.5 million records in that single database. So, and it's from all different points across the Canadian-US border. We also have border crossings from Mexico into the United States. Those date from 1895 to 1964. Almost 6 million records in that particular collection. And then we have border crossings from the US back up into Canada, so from 1908 to 1935. Now, one of the things you may discover in these collections is that sometimes people went back and forth across the border a lot of times, and so they might be in this database more than once. Sometimes it's your ancestor who immigrated from Europe, came to Canada first, or came to Mexico first, because that was cheaper passage or easier immigration. And then sometimes, like the very next day, they're taking a train or walking across a bridge in Laredo to get into the United States. Sometimes they stay in Canada or Mexico for 6 months or 8 months or 2 years before gaining the necessary paperwork or citizenship or immigration requirements in order to come into the country. So be sure to check some of those if you have family stories of people you've been looking for and haven't been able to find them coming into the United States. It may be because they went to Canada or Mexico first and then came into the United States. And most oftentimes that was an economic decision because it was cheaper passage, transatlantic passage into those countries typically, but sometimes it was also just an immigration issue with making sure that their immigration paperwork was in order before they came into the country. And then, like I said, we have those US back into Canada. So we do see some families, particularly families who live close to the border in different areas, have families on both sides of the border. You see people going back and forth a lot. Again, that might be a really big clue, right? If you've been looking to discover where in Ireland your family came from and you find them going back and forth across the Canadian border a few times, maybe they have a brother that lives in Canada, or maybe their parents live in Canada, and that will give you additional clues that will lead you to exactly where in Ireland they came from. And then for whatever reason, we've got the border crossings at Detroit. They're broken out into a separate database with the Detroit passenger lists for the years 1905 through 1963, almost 2 million records in that specific collection, so great resources there. Now, most of you know Ancestry also has naturalization indexes and originals. So if your ancestor was here, became a US citizen, that they would have gone through the process of naturalization, and the federal government requested that all naturalization indexes, copies of them be turned over to them. Most states complied, not all states did. So we have whatever indexes the National Archives held at a federal level, those have been digitized and put online. Also, whatever naturalization originals held at a federal level, those have been digitized and put online. And then again, a little underutilized database that a lot of you aren't aware of that Ancestry has is a database called passport applications. A lot of times we get it in our head that our ancestor left the old country for whatever reason, sometimes fleeing persecution or conscription or just for a better life or whatever the case may be. And we get it in our head that they would have never gone back. Well, you might be surprised to discover how many times some of these people went back, either to get additional family members to bring them over, or in some cases just to visit ailing parents, or sometimes for educational opportunities, lots of different reasons. And so whether they were a citizen or not, sometimes they would still have to apply for a passport, and that passport would give details about where they were born and who they were visiting in the old country. And sometimes it will list information about spouses and children and birth dates and places. And sometimes they're really, really rich documents, and sometimes they're kind of skimpy. It just kind of depends. One of my favorite things is when I find a photograph of them, and that's always exciting to be able to see a face looking back at me off of one of these documents. So be sure to check those out. Now, I'm just going to run really quickly through a list of military records. In particular, let me just start with the 1890 Veterans Schedule. Now, most of you know that the 1890 US federal census was destroyed. There was a fire, and then there was water damage from putting out the fire, and only fragments of the 1890 US federal census survive. However, the 1890 Veterans Schedule was collected as part of the 1890 census, and specifically what was requested was information about veterans and widows and orphans of the veterans from the Union Army during the US Civil War. Now, there are some Confederate soldiers who are included in this as well, but essentially we've got this really great veterans schedule that lists information about those individuals, and this piece of that 1890 census survived. Again, be sure to read the database description because it's going to give you information about what is and is not included in this particular set of records. Check that browse box to make sure that your state or location is included. You'll see it is not every single state. It is only a limited list of states, but it is certainly worth researching if you have an ancestor or family member who served in the US Civil War, particularly if they served for the Union, but there are some Confederate soldiers included, so be sure to check that out as well. There's also a database full of Civil War prisoner of war records. We've got National Homes for the Disabled Volunteer Soldiers records. Sons of the American Revolution membership applications are online. So Ancestry has an agreement with the Sons of the SAR, the Sons of the American Revolution, and their membership applications for the last century have been digitized and placed online. Now there is a little caveat to that particular collection, which is that as part of our agreement with the SAR, they will not allow people to print those records out or to copy them or download them. And so we'll show them to you, but if you actually want a copy of that record, you would need to contact the SAR. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is to remember that these are just compiled genealogies by individuals trying to connect their family to someone who served in the American Revolution. And some of those have since been proven inaccurate. And so contacting the SAR will get you the most current information about that particular individual or that particular application. Now, speaking of the American Revolutionary War, there are also bounty land warrant applications. So one of the things that the soldiers received as part of their pay for serving was bounty land. And so they get these, they applied for this bounty land so they could get acreage after their service to go and set up, themselves and their family. And so there's some really great details in those records about the individual's service and sometimes about their family members as well. And then every state also has their own military collection of some sort. And Ancestry has worked with state archives and state libraries and tried to collect as many of those collections as possible. So be sure to search the card catalog by state also to see what else you might be able to find. Okay, we are totally out of time, but let me just leave you with a little bit of a bonus. And we'll be talking about this in more detail in a couple of weeks. But I wanted to just talk briefly about some educational gems that you might not be aware of. So these, again, are resources available on Ancestry. Be sure to check out our support center. You're going to find the support center here under Help. Just click Support Center. And then anything you could want to know, somebody else has probably asked that question. And so we've got these great resources out here where you can ask questions about searching in records or about member trees or about DNA. You can type in your own search query to see if we've got articles or help material about that. Super great resource there. We also have free research guides. In that support center, if you just type in research guide, you'll find we have, over the course of several years, several of the genealogists here at Ancestry, including myself, created these free downloadable PDF research guides to help you. We've got one for every state. We've got different ethnic groups covered. So if you're doing African American research or Native American research, or if you're doing Quaker research or Catholic research, or, like all these different groups that we could think of, we tried to create research guides to help you understand some of the nuances of the research for that particular group of people or those particular ancestors. So be sure to check those out. Also, under the Extras button on Ancestry, so if I come back here, back to Ancestry, and I click on Extras, you're going to notice a link there to the Ancestry Academy. Ancestry Academy is essentially genealogy conference lectures by some of the best specialists, the best professional genealogists who specialize in specific areas of research, and we have recorded those presentations and provided you with access to those, and those are all free. So be sure to go and take advantage of that. And then the last thing I just want to remind you of is that Ancestry has a whole bunch of social media channels, but we also have a blog. So if you just go down to the very bottom of the Ancestry homepage, you're going to see a link to our corporate blog. We've got a corporate Facebook page. We've got a Twitter account. We're on Instagram and Pinterest. Anywhere you can think of, we are out there trying to talk to you and share tips and tricks with you about how to continue to grow your family tree. Of course, my favorite is our YouTube channel, so be sure to head over there and subscribe, or if you're watching this video right now, there should be a subscribe link to subscribe to the Ancestry YouTube channel, and then you will be notified anytime a new episode of The Barefoot Genealogist is uploaded to our YouTube channel. Well, that is all I had prepared for you today. Hopefully this was useful. If you have suggestions for other topics you'd like addressed, please feel free to email me at ask@ancestry.com with those suggestions. I'll see what I can do about working them into the calendar for future videos. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.